What are museums for? Whose stories do they tell? How do they decide which aspects of the past to preserve and represent?
I'm Syson, Director of the Fitzwilliam Museum at the University of Cambridge.
And I'm Nicola Jennings, Director of the Athena Art Foundation.
And over the course of 6 conversations, we're inviting a range of cultural figures, from directors and curators and researchers to activists and writers, to share their thoughts on the role of the museum in the 21st century.
We'll be looking at the modern museum through a variety of lenses, exploring some of the key questions museums around the world are currently asking themselves. How can museums represent the diverse communities they serve? To whom do cultural artifacts and their narratives belong? What role can digital technologies play? How can museums work sustainably to preserve our futures, as well as our pasts?
This podcast series is a Fitzwilliam Museum, Carnegie Foundation, and Athena Art Foundation co-production. Hello everybody. The idea of nation as it's enshrined in museums might in the past have played out in a number of ways, whether as displays of a country's history, and I think the pride in that history of the nation's treasures, which perhaps is a kind of statement of wealth and confidence, or perhaps exploring the arts and industry of a nation, again, perhaps as a statement of pride. Probably most complicatedly is the idea of the National Museum, of the museum in general, as for the benefit of a nation and its people, as a civilizing force. In Britain, I would argue that long assumptions around what it is to be British, based on global expansion and a notion of industry, whether capital I and a small one, began to disappear in the second half of the 20th century. And it's a question, I guess, of how that sense of ourselves has been replaced, if at all. And arguably, the Brexit debate, on whichever side you're on, really reignited that sense of what nationhood meant. And so perhaps now museums, more than ever, need to think about that word, that term, nation and national, in new ways. Are they expanded, altered, discredited terms? How do we celebrate the works of other nations? And what part in particular do we who work in museums or visit them have to play?
Today, we're delighted to be joined by Sussan Babaie. Sussan is Professor of the Arts of Iran and Islam at the Courtauld. She's curated exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1989, the Sackler Museum at Harvard in 2010, and with her students at Michigan and Smith College University Museums as well. Gabriele Finaldi has been Director of the National Gallery in London since August 2015. Prior to that, he was Deputy Director for Collections and Research at the Museo Nacional del Prado in Madrid, and he's curated exhibitions in Britain, Spain, Italy, Belgium, and the US. So we're delighted that you both could join us today. I'm going to start with Sussan. Museums have traditionally played an important role in forging national identity. Where do nationhood and national identity fit today into the question of collections?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I think there is a really important question embedded in there, which is about the definition of nationhood and whose view are we looking at? Many of the nations of, let's say, the Middle East, or what used to be the Ottoman Empire, are younger in their formation and therefore in their formation of identities. And so many of them have museums of national treasures, so to speak, which can be contested. And I think that contested notion of nationhood, national identity, and collections is a hugely important part of it. So I want to remind us of, for instance, what triggered the first Gulf War in 1991, the invasion of Kuwait, but not just the invasion of a little city-state, but the carting off of what was the collection in the National Museum, if you will, of Kuwait. It's like you cart off the national identity by taking away the objects, as it has happened again and again since in the Middle East, in areas where war-torn environments have really targeted museums and objects in museums. And the idea is very different from what we might consider national museum collections in the UK or in various places in Europe or in America, in that they tend to be really focused on national collections. In other words, the idea of all these works of art belong to this land, so to speak, that historically have been located there. So there's a difference between a museum that claims a broader reach and has actually been involved in defining what is a national identity, let's say, in Britain, versus one that has cumulatively collected material locally. And so the Egyptian National Museum is a very different kind of a museum, in my view, than what we might call a national museum in a European context. And I honestly don't quite know what is a national museum, let's say, in Britain. What do we call a national? Which of our museums do we call National Gallery? It would be really great to hear from Gabriele what he thinks about that.
Absolutely. Well, I think you've raised all sorts of questions that we're going to come back to. Let's go to Gabriele. You are the director of the National Gallery of Britain. How does nationhood and national identity fit into your collection?
It's an absolutely fascinating question, and I think Sussan has instantaneously pointed out some of the complexities and the contradictions and the difficulties in trying to understand exactly what we're talking about anyway. The concept of nation is a very, very multi-layered one. It's one that has very kind of strong political interpretations. It's contested as we speak. That's why it's so interesting. That's why it's so important that we do talk about it and try and get a bit of a handle on what it's all about. You talked about what is a national museum, or why should a museum be called a national museum? And I've reflected on this a bit, partly because the museum that I work in does actually have national in its title. It's ambiguous and in some ways confusing, because people look at the title on the facade of the portico of the National Gallery. They see National Gallery, and I think the natural assumption is that this is a collection of national art, so it's a collection of British art. Of course it isn't. I used to work in a national museum in Spain, and it was always very interesting to me that on the continent, one spoke very readily of state museums that belong to the state, the political structure of the country. Whereas in Britain, we had a slightly different notion of nation, and it was the different notion of nation, which really means a collective of peoples. That's what seemed to be embedded in the notion of the National Gallery. In other words, it's not so much that this is a state museum, one that belongs to the state, but one that belongs to the people. It's certainly a way of kind of circumventing the complexity of the issue. But it does raise the question of who really owns these museums? Who do they belong to? Are they state institutions? Do they have a broader sense of ownership? The whole concept of these big museums being universal museums that belong to everyone. You're getting into quite complex areas of semantics on the one hand, and, issues of, who pays for them? Who technically is the owner of them? How these works of art that fill them come into these collections and so on. It's an incredibly complex situation, but one that we need to constantly be reflecting on and talking about. And of course, there's been a fascinating kind of evolution in the way we look at our museums, the way we think about museums. They've become contested in a way that really has never been the case before.
Gabriele, can I ask you a follow-up question to that? The National Gallery, like the Fitzwilliam, is predicated on a sense of perhaps the superiority or the primacy of European art. And within that story, we tell a story sometimes more loudly than at other moments of British art or English art. Does that present you with a particular challenge at this moment as you think about a museum or gallery for the people, given that this notion of the people is perhaps much more heterogeneous, much more diverse than at any time in our history?
It's very interesting the way art produced in these islands has featured in the way the gallery has presented itself. Initially, British art was rather limited in its presence at the National Gallery. Then it grew very considerably. At a certain point, it was decided that it was creating a very unbalanced collection. It was consequently necessary to found another museum that would host the history of British art, and that's the Tate, which is established at the end of the 19th century. And the way the gallery has approached this question in recent decades is to present essentially a European story. It's a story which can be told in lots of different ways, but we work with what we have and we work with what our predecessors bequeathed to us. And that's not only the collection itself, it's also a certain way of thinking about it, a certain literature that exists from the Renaissance right down to our time. And the concern has always been, well, how do you fit British art or British painting, which has been produced on an island, which has often wanted to distinguish itself, mark out distinctive characteristics with regard to continental art. How do you embed that in a broader European story? And that's really been the challenge, not only in terms of what you show, but also how you tell the story around it. And it's an evolving one, and it's one that you're always challenging yourself about. There's a certain sort of orthodoxy about what British art is, how it connects, how it fits into the broader European story. But that's also changing all the time. And, the collections are often slow in catching up with the different ways in which we think of British art within a broader context, and not just European, but also a broader world context.
Sussan, as somebody who's lived in several countries and who probably, like me, goes to museums to understand more about where you're living, how do you see the role of museums in this country as giving you a sense of a nation's history and its current identity?
Yes, no, this is such an important question and a subject of such complications, and clearly an opening for all kinds of, again, contested or controversial issues to think about. The way museums in this country are set up, and I would like to focus this on London because majority of what might be considered national collections are concentrated in London. So the National Gallery with its continental European focus, Tate Britain for Britain, the British Museum for the rest of the world, more or less, and V&A for the rest of the world and everything from a design point of view, and so on. And these represent potential critical perspectives on the pasts that have been constructed and the narratives that are being told. Narratives that are loaded, are deeply political, and now very difficult, in fact, to encounter without having to dismantle, at least conceptually, to dismantle and reassemble in order for us to be able to think as British without being born on the island or not being of what is considered a particular ethnicity. And I really think that that's where the problem comes. How do we represent a British arts, paintings, prints, and so forth in a country where the demographics are very different from when these collections were formed, when they were in fact conceptualized as a collection, and those literatures that surround them to which we all turn are indeed raising a whole lot more questions than solving them. So there is something about who are the publics for these museums and who are we addressing in terms of a sense of a national identity. I'm a fairly recent British citizen, so there is a different sense of that idea of nation that I get out of the museums. And I imagine those whose home cultures are very different from what the museums are presenting as narratives of nationhood, would also feel that way. So it may very well be that we need to really consider ways to repackage or rethink those narratives of national identity, especially in this country, but in general, perhaps in Europe and North America.
Isn't it also that our notion of art has changed so much in the last 150, 200 years since the National Gallery was set up? Because it's not just the demographics of Britain that have changed, it's the way we think about art. And at that point, it was the National Gallery because a collection was being given to the nation for the nation to enjoy and to educate the nation about what art was. I think today, if we formed a collection like that, we would have a very different kind of collection because it would have to reflect a much more inclusive notion of the different possibilities of art, different things that we take as art today. And I think that's also part of the problem. I would imagine, Gabriele, that's a real challenge, although you've had lots of people come in, like Chris Ofili and, people from very different types of artistic background as resident artists at the National Gallery, haven't you?
I think that museums are not monolithic institutions. They are constantly evolving. The people who run them are changing. The kind of audiences that we're addressing are changing. The politicians who have some influence on what we do are changing. And, we carry with us our history. And, history is partly what makes up identity. So, we carry this with us while at the same time trying to reinterpret it, trying to understand it, trying to open it up to broaden the interpretation and the understanding of what we have and how we want to enrich it. And I think this is what's fascinating. Museums are extraordinarily resilient and successful institutions, and they're successful and resilient because they've been very skillful in reinterpreting themselves and inviting constant reinterpretation from other people as well. And I think, I look at the National Gallery now and the National Gallery when I first joined in the early 90s. It's a very different institution. The core of the collection, of course, is the same, but the way we talk about it, the way we present it, the variety of people who speak about it and in some way make it their own, it's just a much broader range of people. One thing that Sussan said that came to my mind is that, we are in a city where we have this extraordinary range of collections. And I think it's useful to think of, all of these collections together as something that we can all have a stake in, that we can all share. There are people from many different geographical backgrounds who can somehow find in the National Collection something of their own. There is something about, identity strengthening, which is in our collections. There's always going to be a dispute or debate about how those things are presented and the way in which the narratives are told. But there's no doubt that museums play a role in placemaking for people who have come into Britain from elsewhere.
Yeah, I think Gabriele's point about let's say, London collections, they are quite vast, they are diverse, and they're all available for different people to choose from. That's incredibly important to note and underscore. What I wanted to add was that the different zones and definitions of these museum collections and the way they are displayed and narrativized make stories that have hierarchies, that have political dimensions embedded in them, whether we speak it or not. That's how it is seen. So in some ways, I go back to thinking, how do we define a masterpiece? So the National Gallery is filled with masterpieces, essentially. There's nothing that is not a masterpiece in there. But is the V&A the same? Is the British Museum the same? As, for instance, the British Museum and V&A are not museums of art. They don't define themselves as art museums. And by definition, it creates a different class, a different category as against a national gallery with masterpieces presented. That, by definition, distinguishes what is European art from everybody else's. And I think there lies a responsibility to think differently about how do we actually rethink our museum cultures and rethink the way we represent these different cultural histories of people from all over the world. The world is present in London. It's remarkable. But how do we present them as equals? It's that sort of a complication that seems to me to be what museums will be in the business of looking at more carefully, more critically.
I think this question of a distinction between art on the one hand and perhaps evidence on another is a really crucial one. Speaking as somebody who's worked in museums my whole life, I think it's probably much easier to think differently about the mission of museums than it is to move everything around from place to place. And I think it is important to be making that distinction. I used to work at the Met, which defines itself as a museum of art. It is an important distinction. I work now in a university museum, which is defined in terms of its content by what was thought to be civilized in around sort of 1900 to 1940, and which is counted as art, whereas the products of the Global South or the Americas are at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology and are therefore implied not to be. So the way in which we will work together is very important. And I think the point that Nicola was making earlier on about the more permeable, more expansive definition of art is important. What it does leave is still a challenge for an area of work like easel painting, which belongs to a particular global tradition, a European tradition primarily. One of the things that's very striking about going to the Louvre Abu Dhabi with its extraordinary range of materials from prehistory to now is that the easel painting creeps in at a certain moment as a European phenomenon. And I suppose that's still one of the great challenges here. How do we look at Europe and indeed Britain as a society and a culture that has always been absorbent of others, sometimes in ways we now find unacceptable, but which still has its own parameters in a way that I think we would feel uncomfortable about denying to other parts of the world. Gabriele, one of the questions here is, how do we adapt to that and think about our collection in a new way, or do we simply do something different and talk about in very clear terms what it is that the collection is setting out to demonstrate and achieve?
Well, I think it's extremely important that our collections arise from very particular historical circumstances. We're in particular places, we have a particular collecting history, and we have historically rooted collections, and I think that needs to be recognised, understood, and talked about. Nicola raised the question, how would you do if you were to start all over again? Well, you'd probably do it very, very differently. But on the other hand, we sit on an accumulation not only of objects, but of discourse, of a certain way of interpreting what we have, a certain way of teaching about it, a certain way of discussing it. But I think we always want to be open to new perspectives, to understand the limitations of what we've inherited, and open it up to broader debate, which is sometimes challenging and difficult, but I think is healthy for the institution. I don't think we should allow museums to become lazy and monolithic. We should be constantly asking questions of our museums, and we should approach a museum with the sense that we want the museum to ask us questions as well. I think we should be much more active visitors and say, what kind of story is being told here? Where do I fit in? What stories aren't being told? What's my role in all of this? And I think sometimes we're quite uncritical in the way we approach museums, and we think that they're set in stone and that's the way things are.
That takes us to a future question. What roles should museums play in imagining the future? How can museums help us to reimagine the future? Gabriele, would you say something about that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I'm glad that Luke raised Louvre Abu Dhabi, because there's one interesting model of how that can be done. That you have the mother of all museums playing a role in advising a much younger nation state in how they might want to tell a story in the museum that they've created. So a whole series of assumptions, I suppose, come along with that undertaking, while at the same time confronting a world landscape which is, very different from the one that sits at the origin of the Louvre Museum. And how do those two things come together? How do you find a discourse which is both historical and open to a much broader worldview? And, the Louvre Abu Dhabi is one way of doing it, to tell cross-boundary narratives, to look at certain universal themes, as they might be called, and to look at how they're treated in different cultures. There's certainly a real concern with high artistic quality with elaborately wrought objects, but there's certainly the desire to tell a much broader cross-border story.
I think what's interesting there, and I'd love to get Sussan's take on this, is it's also a museum about national and regional identity, because while it posits itself as quite correctly a museum of the global, it's also positioning itself as one of the great crossroads of the world where cultures come to meet, and that's very much about how the UAE and Abu Dhabi in particular wishes to see itself. It seems to me that one thing we might be thinking about here, therefore, is returning to this notion of Britishness as a notion which has that kind of inclusive quality, which sits sometimes very complicatedly as a crossroads nation, as a place where cultures meet. Sometimes, as I say, as a result of colonial histories that we now are forced to explore. I wonder, Sussan, is that a way of thinking about how British museums might still look at the island history, if you like, but in a way that is expansive and global in the way that Gabriele has just described?
Yes, definitely. First, I want to say something about this new nation formation, identity formation, as the patron of a global museum, as it has happened in UAE and Abu Dhabi in particular. It represents to us another perspective that may also not be as critical and as alert to the new models of the world connected or disconnected as we experience today. And the political undertones are incredibly important. These are collections without history, and therefore we have to wait and see what they present to us. And they are coming out of the Louvre intervention. Is the Louvre intervention something for us to consider critically? Is this totally benign? So going back to Britain, it reminded me when you were talking about the great works of European artists that the British public doesn't know that great paintings were made in Mughal India or Rajasthan or other kingdoms of India, or the fantastic, distinctive Persian manuscript painting, which itself is a source of inspiration for those that appear in India or in the Ottoman world. These are tucked away in the British Library, totally invisible except for a sampling here and there. So in the end, it appears that painting of that kind of high quality, painting that looks like thinking, like making points about history and places and people, is absent from cultures outside of the European grand paintings, easel paintings, and so forth. It's not that the National Gallery or galleries, various museums in the country do not represent different parts of the world. It's that it's uneven and that it really masks the realities of those historical formations. So where do these manuscripts come from? And for us to know that they are the products of philological interest, they are the products of interest of Orientalists, that they are products of collecting of the empire and the administration of the empire. That sort of story is not told the way the history of this nation should be told, in my view, that those are the missing pieces that would make the future of museums something else. And perhaps even where the emphasis is on European paintings and masterpieces, injecting something of those comparatives. The work of Sultan Muhammad, this fantastic early 16th century Persian painter, and put him right next to a Leonardo. Scale is different, but in terms of concentrated energy that goes into an artistic product, they compete. And it would be great for us to know that those people existed, those kinds of works were there, that people east of Istanbul were inspired by the Persian painter, not by the Florentine painter. That really is crucial. In my view.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's going to be very interesting what happens over the next 10 years, for example, in Africa, as objects like the Benin bronzes, the restituted objects, what they actually make of them in these new museums that are going to tell stories from their perspective. I think that's going to be very interesting for us to reflect on in Europe in terms of how we value the objects that we still have in our collections here.
And meanwhile, Gabriele, I'm wondering if we can't move objects permanently around collections, can we imagine a future where people in positions like ours are setting out through projects and through long-term mutual loans to explore exactly the kind of thing that Sussan has suggested?
Yeah, and I feel that in many ways, art history as a discipline often moves way ahead of the museums themselves, the pioneer thinkers who enable us to have sometimes the courage, I suppose, to do things which now may seem unthinkable or not the right thing for our institutions. I remember when I was working in Madrid, we were informed that the Emperor of Japan was coming to Spain and it would be very appropriate to do something in the Prado. We eventually managed to borrow two extraordinary 17th century Japanese screens and hung them close to Velázquez's Las Meninas. These were objects that had relatively little to do with one another, but the encounter was thrilling and gave rise to all kinds of unexpected perspectives. Sometimes we have a tendency to stick to our own disciplines. That's where we feel most comfortable and perhaps miss out on opportunities which can be aesthetically liberating and visually exciting.
So I think what we're beginning to conclude is that the sense of nation might depend on less individual institutions and more the sense of a national collection, and how we might work effectively together to think through some of these particular challenges. I agree with Gabriele, we can get sometimes bogged down in tradition and in that sort of sense of, oh gosh, how on earth are we going to manage this in practical ways? Who's going to pay for it? And so on. So actually what we might be arguing for is a kind of program of work that is genuinely cross-institutional, where we're looking for external support to undertake some of this work.
Do you think, Luke, in a world which is so much more connected than it ever has been, are we failing to take advantage of the great collections that we have at our disposal? And I don't just mean across different museums, but potentially, your museum is essentially a universal museum. How do you approach these big questions of cross-cultural fertilization?
I think it's a key question, which I'm also keen to hear from Sussan on, that we're not addressing very well yet at the Fitzwilliam. We have little separate galleries for Islamic art, however that's defined, for Korean art, for Chinese, and actually for a museum which has always called itself universal, have excluded the Global South and the Americas. So I think we're beginning to do that through projects. So for example, quite soon, Magdalena Odundo is selecting works from the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology and from the Fitzwilliam that inspired her extraordinary ceramic practice now. And one of the things that was really marvellous to discover was that she discovered the pottery of Nigeria, coming herself from Kenya, in Cambridge. Nicola, shall we give the last word to Sussan on this?
Well, thank you. It's not a last word, but just to think ahead. First of all, I think, Luke, the idea of artists, living artists, being the glue here might be a really good one. At Fitzwilliam, the pairing of a Saint Sebastian sculpture and the figural sculpture by Reza Ramesh is evocative, it's provocative, it's really important to break away from these sealed concepts of what is Renaissance and what is contemporary and so on. But also to think a little bit more in terms of, can you, in fact, not only across museums, think of borrowing objects which are all in London, for instance, and taking them on a temporary project that would change the way we look at an easel painting or the way we look at sculpture. And then also think, while we are at it, at the subject of nationhood, to really critically think, what is Islamic gallery? What is an Islamic art? Where do we fit the Egyptians and the Turks and the Iranians? And are they not nations, or do they not deserve to be seen as nations? I mean, these are really complicated issues to consider. So, we talk about British art, Korean art, Japanese art, but we don't talk about museum with a segment given to Iranian art or Egyptian art, unless they are pharaonic material. As Gabriele said, the new generation of artists and scholars and art historians and academics will throw all of this up in the air, and one hopes that they come up with some fresh thinking. But museums right now can at least insert some of these fresh thinkings in small chunks. I think some museums are already doing it. You're doing it, Luke. National Gallery's taking of our Islamic metalwork, the Courtauld metalwork, has been very helpful in throwing our objects into another context as well. So some small steps, they have to be taken sooner rather than waiting for another generation or two to change our national narrative. But it can be pushed forward on much more manageable levels.
Well, thank you both so much. And it was a fascinating conversation.